we've got to change the way we work. We have to, or have teams that work differently. Then it gets down to generative AI as a transformation. It's a change management. It's a technology that requires transformation to enable it.
Welcome to the / podcast, where we lean into the future of IT by inviting fellow thought leaders, innovators, and problem solvers to slash through its complexity. I'm your host, James Carman, and today we're talking to Justin Trombold. Justin Trombold is a strategy advisor and GenAI thought leader who helps organizations turn emerging technologies into measurable business value. As president of Antecin Advisors, he guides executive teams in aligning enterprise strategy, operating models, and technology investments to accelerate transformation. Justin is the creator of the Enterprise Generative AI Readiness Diagnostic, a framework that helps companies move beyond experimentation and scale AI responsibly and effectively. With a background spanning academia, consulting, and enterprise innovation, he specializes in translating complex concepts into practical actions, enabling leaders to navigate uncertainty, build future-ready capabilities, and harness AI to reshape how work gets done. That's a cool bio. I like that one. That's really good.
You made me sound more impressive than I am, but we'll let your listeners make that judgment for themselves as they
Well,
go.
welcome to the show, Justin. Happy to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Okay. So I know it's not in your bio, but there was one aspect that I thought, I was like, this is interesting. Kind of threw me for a curveball. Please tell the audience what is you have a PhD. What is your PhD in? What is the field?
Yeah. And so it's in human physiology. I would say that I think there are two ways to think about it. One is the arc and perhaps, why I'm sitting where I'm sitting instead of sitting in a lab or giving a lecture. I guess this is the new lecture is doing podcasts, but then also what does it mean for your listeners? Why do they care what that arc was? But yeah, I did my doctorate in human physiology and at that time, even within the constructs of academia, and I'll assume that there are probably some listeners that know how academia is structured, but perhaps more that don't. I was doing doctoral work and had an interest in changing the area in which I was focused in. So I was switching from what was originally more sports science, sports nutrition, sports performance into more clinical diabetes settings. Still with, there was an exercise element, there was a nutrition element to it, but it was related to diabetes. And I think that was my first taste of, it was about being fun, but it was about intellectually stimulating and the excitement of going into a white space that maybe you're perhaps interested in, but you don't really know what the right questions are. You don't know the area quite well enough. So jumping in and establishing that foundation to then make that transition. That should have been a harbinger of things to come, but I got through my training and decided when I was making a choice between some faculty positions and just thought, I think I'm done with this academia thing. Let's give consulting a try. You get the typical consulting pitch. You get to do all these fun, exciting projects, and there's a portion of that that's true. But of course, there's another side of that that maybe you should have expected but didn't. But you make that transition and it lives up to it for the most part. There's certainly more variety. There's a little bit less. You have to hyper specialize in a single thing. And so made that transition to scratch that curiosity itch that I think I got the feel for when I made that early transition. And so then, of course, I'm sitting in these big firms, doing that work. And as someone that liked the curiosity and liked the independence that I had as an academic, I started to yearn for that again, but in the consulting area. And when my kids were born, I felt like I couldn't do the big firm consulting lifestyle anymore. Plus I wanted a bit more freedom. Switched over to do independent consulting. And that was right around the time the generative AI stuff started to hit. And so these concepts and themes started showing up in my inbox, so to speak. And we were talking to leaders and business executives and there was an excitement as I started to talk to them. There was a lot of discussion about technology, right? Which was, here's the data, here's different aspects that you need to pay attention to. But what was really, really interesting to me that I heard a lot about is that technology readiness matters, but organizational readiness matters more. And the ability and the interesting part of why that is, there's perhaps a lot of reasons, and we can go into more detail, but just a bit of a frame up. What I think is unique at this stage is you have a tool in generative AI, and instead of let's say with a Salesforce process or, whatever the SaaS solution is, where at a given step in the workflow, you have 7 options that were flushed out by the developers of the software. You have the universe of options at every stage in whatever workflow you're trying to put together. And so that inherently introduces a lot of uncertainty, a lot of variability. And that's hard for people to wrap their heads around. And so those questions started to emerge, and it got me excited about how do you help organizations then conquer some of those challenges like I had to face when I changed my research track? What did I do, and how do I, and then taking my consulting learnings, how did I string those pearls together? And so that was the initial thinking when those started coming up.
Well, it's funny. So you were in physiology, and you're around kind of in the diabetes area. You went from diabetes and then all this GLP-1 stuff. There's a lot of money going on there. So you happen to find the only other industry that could possibly make more money than GLP-1s right now, and that's AI. So that's pretty good. Okay.
And the GLPs were like that a little bit past my time, but certainly I keep a casual eye on it. I tell most people, like, at this stage, if people have questions about GLP-1s, like I can deconstruct it and think about it maybe more clearly than others, but I'm not any more up to speed on where the literature is than anybody else. Like I have to take whatever people say at face value because I just don't follow. Only so much time in the day to keep up with things.
Well, no matter which path you chose, you were going to be swimming in money, but you're picking great industries. So, all right.
I like to say swimming in purpose.
Yeah.
And then if the money follows, the money follows.
Yeah. Hopefully the purpose is a good one. Yeah. All right. So generative AI, you talked about kind of readiness. So what kind of clients are you working with like these days? And what's kind of one of the big problems that organizations are seeing when they would, pick up the phone and give you a call?
Yeah. So the 2 main types of clients are, larger enterprises or business units within a large company, and then smaller companies, I think anywhere between like 1 to 20 individuals. So maybe not surprisingly, those types of companies have a lot of the same things that have to be true in order to get where they want to go. But, the unique things between those 2 groups is that typically larger organizations, of course, they have more robust processes, but they also have more entrenched processes and more entrenched ways of working. Yeah. So it typically becomes a lot more about that diagnostic you referred, the generative AI readiness diagnostic of, hey, where are you today? What things do you do that are either enabling or perhaps a blocker for your generative AI strategy? How well do you collaborate? How well do your leaders engage people across the organization? How well do business units communicate, share data, work together, and so forth? But with smaller organizations, it's a bit of the same theme, but there's much less variance in where they are. They're let's assume it's not a generative AI first company, right? So a typical small business. There's a lot of fear and a feeling that, well, we're so far behind the large organizations, we don't even know where to start. Like we have to make a big splash or do nothing. And what we try to do is first give people just a general sense of what is a generative AI mindset to, what does it mean to be curious? What does it mean to think about generative AI as an opportunity rather than something to be afraid of? And then we take a step back and say, well, let's just start with training your people. Let's get your people aware of what it looks like to define a process or a segment of a process. Judiciously think, is this segment of that process worth testing a generative AI solution? Have your actual people, the people on the team that are doing the work, go in and start creating sort of, we call it grassroots, but creating their own solutions using enterprise instances of generative AI tools, your ChatGPT, your Groks, your Gemini, whatever it is.
Yeah. And
start experimenting. And then what that does is it builds capability in your people, which is inherently important. It's important for the company, but it's important for that individual for whatever their job prospects are going forward with or without the company. But then what you do is it's like, okay, well, now let's create a very clear pipeline that says, based on those experiments, here's how we decide if they scale or not. And what we do is we work with a couple other partners that are a little bit more in the technology, have their hands in the technology part. And it's like, look, yeah, you're generating value, let's say 10% efficiency gains, this one person by doing this one thing. We have 5 other people that do that same thing. Can we create a more robust tech solution that streamlines that even more and can bring in more people? And so what does that do? So it overcomes the fear problem, back to your question, because they start experimenting, they see what it can and can't do. That's from the people standpoint. From the leadership standpoint, it overcomes the fear problem of investing in something that doesn't provide value. Mm-hmm. So you inherently know that it provides value because it's something that people are already doing. It's part of their workflow. And then you remove the fear there. And then you chase good dollars after good ideas rather than chasing good dollars after a technology solution that you don't know for sure if it'll fit with what your needs are.
And, I think with any of these, technology advancements and whatnot, one of the things that can be difficult, and I'd love to hear your take on this, but organizations, we want to adopt a new technology. It is going to change the way we work. What I find is really hard is getting people to kind of take that step back and look at more holistically at the picture. Because can I automate the current workflow that I have? Absolutely. We can make things faster. However, when new things become available, the world is different. How would I approach this problem, this business problem differently? Mm-hmm. If I had GenAI back when we created this workflow, this workflow wouldn't mm-hmm. exist in the first place, probably. Can we take a step back and take a different look at this problem and rethink it? Do you find that that's been difficult for you to kind of get people to shake themselves out of they're in the day to day, right? They're in that workflow every day. Is it hard to pull them back? And how do you go about that?
It's absolutely hard. And perhaps I'll use the analogy of, if your listeners think in their own lives, how hard is it to carve out an hour a day? We'll just say an hour a day, not any more than that. How hard is it to carve out an hour a day that you commit to? Let's say you're working at a company, that you commit to doing something that differentiates you as an employee, or it furthers some other objective that you have, professional development or whatever it might be, or even I want to work an hour less so I can get home on time for my kid's soccer practice, whatever. Yeah. That's very hard to commit yourself to that. And so the way that we view it is getting those quick wins with driving simple efficiencies do 2 things. One, it enables people to then have more time. Now, what we ask is that as part of that process, hold yourselves and your team members to be accountable to define what those things are that you're going to look at, right? So in the case that you're saying, it's if I have an extra hour, if I have an extra 20% of my time now, and this is a bit of a motivator to get people to find those efficiencies and to mm-hmm. then make the case to invest in them. What are those things that you could be looking at, or what are those ideas that have been sitting on the table? That it could be linked back to generative AI, but it might just be something that just hasn't been getting done. Now, the second part of it is that what we find is the more and more people start exploring with these tools, the more and more creative solutions they start coming up with, not just for the problem they're looking at, but for everything else. And so, so the way that it's interesting, so sometimes the question is framed up in terms of, how can a business model be innovated based on having a generative AI first mindset? And that's an important question, but it's often useful, we're seeing, to flip it around and say, now that you have an awareness of what these tools can do and you have time to think about it, what can you now think about that you just didn't have time to think about before? And then it becomes this idea of, you're not under pressure to reinvent the business model. You're just thinking about ways that you're increasing the probability that you'll have an idea that could reinvent part of the business and then maybe another part of the business. I think we've all been in sessions where it's okay, sit down and innovate. It's like, well, that's not so easy. But I think we've also been in scenarios where when something's on your radar, and you become more capable in using tools, ideas seem to pop up out of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like when you're looking for a house, you notice the for sale signs everywhere.
Right.
Right. And you didn't notice them before that point. And so just building that culture. But I think to your question, layering some intentionality on top of it to say, okay, in that extra 10% of time, let's start with putting together a list of areas that, again, putting generative AI aside so there's no pressure, but what are areas that you think we could improve in the work that you do that have been getting left behind because of bandwidth issues? Now make that time for it. Now go and look at those and think, all right, is this a core idea that could change the way that a function functions or a business unit functions or a company functions? And so it's about giving people the space. One last thing I'd add is that a decision that leaders have to make is if you don't have those people internally that have those fresh ideas, if you can now do work more efficiently, and I'm not advocating that organizations have to do this, you of course have more flexibility to find those people that can come in and you're not as worried about the doers. You can bring in the thinkers, the minders, or whatever you want to call them.
Yeah, I love the approach of the kind of almost like that grassroots type of approach. So get people exposed to generative AI, these tools, because it's almost like you're kind of in education by immersion, so to speak, right? Yeah. So they get in, use these tools, and as you said, as I'm playing around with ChatGPT and I'm working through different business problems, I'm thinking, wait a minute, hold on now. ChatGPT did this for me over here in this other problem. What if I applied it here and kind of, so re-swizzle this problem. So it's pretty cool. And you've hit on like that whole idea of like kind of that compounding of, I now have time. Now I have think time to make things even better. So you almost get this like innovation, compounding innovation, not compounding interest, but compounding innovation. I mean, this has happened since like the dawn of time, right? Like you think about human beings, when did we progress? It was, okay, we figured out fire. Okay, now we're not thinking about how do I get my next meal as much, and people are sitting around the fire chewing on a brontosaurus or whatever, right? And then they're looking up at the sky like, why are those little twinkles up there? Or maybe I cut this rock in this round shape and that might make it easier for me to get things from one place to another. So yeah,
I like that. I mean, it's immersion without the necessity of survival.
Yeah.
So you're still in that environment, right? And I like the way that you put that, and that's it's an interesting thing, and to tie that up with what I was saying at the end, you don't really know how good your people are in terms of coming up with creative ideas until they have the space to do that work.
Right. Yeah. If your head's down all day long, cranking through the exact same workflow over and over and over again, you're just not going to see that innovation. They don't have the space for it. They don't have time to like turn on those other parts of their brain, the less mechanical parts and the more innovative parts. They just don't do it. They don't have the time for it. Okay. So, as we were saying before, we've seen technology advancement before, right? This has happened in the past, but something about this one, I'm sure everybody's probably said that in the past. I wasn't saying it about blockchain.
We figured it out before.
Yeah. I was not saying this about blockchain, but this definitely feels different. Like AI feels like it's just hitting different, as the kids would say, right? It definitely seems like it's hitting different in the market. Why is that? What makes this so different?
Yeah. And there are elements of this that are supposition on my part. I'd say that I'll tag with what you said and then take a step back and frame it up. But one aspect that perhaps is different is the accessibility of these tools, meaning that if you think about other technology innovations, and the internet may have been similar in this way, it was, at least from my experience, is that everybody was using the internet in some capacity when it started to become commercially available. So it was very much on everyone's radar, much like you don't have to use an LLM for work to be aware of what it is and perhaps that it's of interest. So what does that do though? That puts it on everybody's radar at the organization. And it definitely puts it on the radar of the leadership. So it provides this dynamic where you have a lot of people that are interested perhaps in using it and also scared at the same time because there's a lot of narrative about job loss. So you get this like excitement, but fear at the same time. Then at the top of the house, what we see is a lot of pressure You can call it keeping up with the Joneses, whatever it might be, but
FOMO,
it isn't about creating value. It's about creating value through generative AI. Well, now what do you have? You have a dynamic where there's a tool that is often misunderstood as something that is a panacea to solve everything.
Yes.
And perhaps it could be, but what it isn't is something to solve everything out of the box, right? It needs to be applied to problems that are understood. So oftentimes there's a gap in terms of what the leadership perceives as what's feasible, because maybe they're hearing a press release of something that may or may not actually be happening, right? Or they're hearing things in news or different releases. And then their expectations start to grow. The leadership's expectations grow. Now then they're thinking, well, what next? What do I invest in? And they're looking for something that already exists that will somehow transform their business.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about things in that direction, there's really never been a technology or a solution that you can just plug it into an existing entity or existing organization, and all of a sudden the people will just start behaving differently.
Mm-hmm.
Right there. So there's a difference there of, with that pressure, there becomes a lot of misaligned investments. Those propagate down, the people start using the tool and they're like, what do I do with this? I don't know what this is doing. We're not then changing the way that we work to unlock value from the tool.
Mm-hmm.
But I think now that with that dynamic framed up, the simplest way that we think about it is, as we said before with the Salesforce example, it's a solution that is everything and nothing all at once. What we mean by that is, if you don't have structure, it's nothing. Like it doesn't matter that it's integrated. If there isn't a clear way that's being deployed and a clear way that your people or even you as a leader are doing your work in coordination with those tools, then it's nothing. If that first step is never taken to start looking for solutions, then it's everything.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It has a solution. Anything that you could have has a potential solution. And so what we think is different now is it's the democratization of it. Even if there is an out of the box tool, you have to really engage your company, engage your peers on the leadership team, engage people in the organization to effectively deploy those democratizing principles and then be able to put together use cases. The other thing that's of interest is, because value being created is so dependent on all these different operating model skill sets that most organizations just don't have because they're not used to working like that. Nobody's as far ahead as they think they are. Meaning, like, every organization has a perspective that they're getting left behind. But the reality is that the way to tackle being left behind isn't, okay, we just need a bigger tech stack. Perhaps it's, okay, we just need to get to the cloud. And maybe that was sufficient, although that's still a thing for a good reason. It's not, so maybe it isn't so different than some of those tech innovations, but you have that push to do that and the pressure to do it. But there's a value gap in too many things that have to be true that organizations don't have visibility into. So providing that visibility and then taking that step back to take 5 steps forward. And so it's having that clarity of thinking and that patience. And there's a bit of an analogy that, we've talked with clients about and I've thought about a bit, that, if you have 2 options, it's like, one, you can try to go on a moonshot and find something and reinvent your business tomorrow. And perhaps you get lucky that you have the right people and the right roles and the solution was right and all the chips fall into place. And there are going to be companies like that.
Sure.
Right. So you could make that bet. You could see if that's going to go that way. But the other bet is taking a more intentional approach. And let's say you don't win. You're not the moonshot that landed on the moon, but you're someone that's still sitting on Earth that developed a great launch pad. Those are going to be the types of companies that are either going to be resilient or they're going to be very attractive to investors, either for acquisitions or partnerships, to say, hey, let's partner with this company that they're not leading the market now, but they have a really great way of working and a great process in place that we can we can layer generative AI efficiencies on top of, or they can plug in with what we're doing. So I think it's a matter of making a more pragmatic, but also forward-looking bet.
Yeah. And I love that kind of you touched on that democratization aspect of generative AI. I think that is the key. It's really kind of weird. Even I think the internet was all, it was DARPANet before, I mean, all that stuff was in academia, like way, way before like the general population was doing it, and business leaders were adopting the internet before the masses were. Generative AI has been different, and I call it kind of the papaw paradox. Like grandpas and grandmas are using generative AI before the CIOs are. They got their hands on it, and they're using this technology before CIOs are even thinking about it. And it's like this. It's become this like whiplash effect of business and enterprises being like, wait a minute, Papaw's using this stuff. Why are we not doing it here at this, multi-billion-dollar organization? And they're like, we just have to be doing AI.
Yeah. And that's the mindset. I mean, if you ask, Papaw or whoever, or even have an honest discussion with yourself, how many more ideas do you have about how you can leverage it for fun things or for personal life just by getting repetitions? And so the difference is, you have to have a bit more structure around it, right? That there are better ways and worse ways to prompt, better ways and worse ways to direct the models to content you want it to and not content you don't want it to. Of course, starting with defining what you're trying to do so that where you're focusing is targeted. Those things have to be true. But once you set that up, you're back to that same thing that the Papaw's doing, which is just getting repetitions, right? And then over time, you get better. And one of the biggest hurdles that we see is we've done trainings where I'm giving example prompts, and they'll be, wait, what was the word on that last page for this prompt? Is like, you don't have to worry about that. Like, yes, it could be a critical word, but what I want to see you do is see that there is some flexibility there. You're not coding
right
in terms of how you put this together, and so that they can get a sense for that this isn't about having a perfect knowledge of how it works and a perfect execution. It's having a framework of doing things and then getting those repetitions.
Yeah, I think that, and it was for me, if I'm being honest, like early on when we were looking at, generative AI, everybody's talking about prompt engineering, and we're going to have degrees in prompt engineering. I was like, oh my gosh, I don't want to have to learn some like this word calculus, like just to make this thing do what I want. Do you feel like, I feel like my perception is like that has become, I think maybe the models are advancing or something, but it feels like that's less important these days. As you said, the exact word isn't important. The exact structuring of the prompt necessarily. Do you see that this is just an anecdotal observation on my part, but it just feels like those technicalities and making sure I have the exact right prompt, it just isn't as important anymore. I feel like it fills in the gaps for you. Has that been your observation?
It's not as important because the models are better, but there's still the element that if you think about generative AI as a very effective analyst that's good at following instructions, but it's also very sensitive to nuances and how you describe the instructions. And so you need to think about it of how are you clearly describing what you're trying to do, particularly if quality on the output is important. And so, what we're seeing, and I think this is part of the model advancement, are two paths. The first one is there are ways you can set up an initial prompt inside of a prompt optimizer structure. And you can say, go and, hey, ChatGPT, hey, Grok, hey, Gemini, optimize this prompt for me based on this is what I want to do. And you can iterate and get to a really good prompt without having to be a master in prompt engineering. But what you do have to be it's not being a master, it's just a bit of an awareness. The less correct a prompt is, or the more things that maybe aren't included in there that need to be in there, the more you have to review the outputs and provide feedback. Right? So there's still an importance of getting it right. But the models are certainly much better, so where you can say, okay, here's the output you gave me. Here's what I like. Here's what I don't like. Ask me clarifying questions. Based on those responses, provide me with a prompt that now captures all of that.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. So there's an iterative thinking that you have to have something right, but the ability to get it right from scratch or the necessary, the need to get it right from scratch isn't as strong as people were perhaps projecting it to be.
And that technique you mentioned, that kind of flipping the script and saying, hey, you LLM, interview me. Because sometimes if you're trying to like just, boil the ocean and find out like what is the most important thing I need to be providing to this LLM, let the LLM guide that exploration and let it ask you questions. That's a really great technique. I love that one. Also, the other thing I'm kind of seeing in the LLM world is, and we're advising our clients, especially around coding, but it's applicable across the board. You do risk, as you get more and more specific with prompts, you do risk kind of losing out on some of the creativity of the LLM itself. And people hear that and they're like, well, it's not creative. It's a machine. It's not creative. Well, it really is, right? So sometimes, especially, and I use it in coding, like, so when you're having an LLM write software for you and helping you write code, it takes creative approaches to things where you're like, whoa, wait a minute. I wouldn't have done that, but that's kind of cool. Those sort of things. And it works on all kinds of different domains, but it has exposure to things that are way outside of, the things you've seen. So giving it a little bit of wiggle room and a little bit of room for creativity can surprise you. So I always tell people, be very careful. Don't go all the way to like the exact, like the most specific that you can. Back off a little bit. Give it a little room to play, and you might see something cool. And only then, if you feel like, okay, I'm just not getting what I need, then get very, very specific with it. But I've found that to be really interesting. So I don't know if has that been your observation?
It is. And I'd say that, that's where that feedback comes in, see what it put out. And you can also, if we call it a little bit of ordered liberty, like you can ask the LLM, let's say you have your prompt saying, okay, one of the things I'm asking you to do is assess, it's in the mind of some of the things that I do. I'm asking you to assess the market attractiveness of something. Do you have any suggestions for how I can break that down into different components? And then what would that do? And so then it can come up with ideas of, hey, here's how market attractiveness is thought about. You can look at it, you're like, oh, I like that, change this thing. And then next thing you know, you have a framework for the model to think about market attractiveness that makes sense to you, makes sense to the LLM. And then you can also say, all right, I also really want to have visibility into each of those 4 areas, why they're good, why they're bad, and how that impacts the overall market attractiveness rating. Do you have any suggestions of how we could do that? Right. And so you can give it this kind of guided creativity.
Yeah.
And so you're thinking of the problem, like you have that in mind. But you're leveraging the LLM's understanding of not just the universe, let's say, but also knowing how to translate ideas into prompts that then deliver what you're looking for.
Yeah. It's interesting because there's, when you look at large language models, there's billions and billions of parameters. The links and the weights that it puts into the model, it makes connections between things that we don't see. Our brains don't make those connections. You know what I mean? So leveraging those, I think that's where that creativity comes in. It makes connections that we're like, oh, wait a minute, I hadn't think of it that way, or I hadn't thought of maybe applying that technique here. It's pretty interesting.
And the flip side is you want to have visibility into what those connections are, because those connections may not be the connections you want. So it's all about like knowing. So if they provide something that's creative, again, you can ask a follow up and be like, that was interesting. How did you do that? Just so okay, I'm okay with you continuing down this creative approach, to ensure alignment there.
So you have this kind of assessment for organizations to kind of this readiness thing. What's one thing that you're noticing? Is there a pattern there where organizations, when they take the assessment, it's kind of an aha moment for them? They're like, oh, I didn't realize that we're not ready, or we had that issue, or an area where we need to build up our capability. What would you say that one thing is, if there is one?
Yeah, to me, it's because we have organizations take it across different layers of the different leadership layers, different functions. The level of disconnect across the organization in terms of how they assess themselves. And so it's always hard to tell if someone's assessing themselves accurately. That's just the nature of doing a survey, right? But in terms of what the leadership thinks, how well people collaborate, what the leadership thinks on their track record of generating value from technology investments, some of the key questions that are in there that are associated with readiness, there's usually a pretty substantial disconnect. And so the main aha moment is, hey, first, I wasn't quite aware I wasn't thinking of it that way yet. But then two, I didn't realize we weren't as good at that as I thought we were. And so just that recognition of that. And then I'd say it's not an aha, but it's an, SHIT moment, which is we've got to change the way we work. And or at least in part we have to, or have teams that work differently. And then it gets down to generative AI as it's transformation. It's a change management. It's a technology that requires transformation to enable it.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that for sure. Okay. Well, this has been a really cool deep dive into, kind of organizational impact on AI. And this is all fascinating. And we're just, I think we're really just scratching the surface. I mean, this stuff is so new. It'll be interesting to see in a couple of years, where are the impacts, what are these impacts that are having on our organizations and our cultures and our vision, our strategy for organizations, all of that. It's going to be really fascinating to see. But we need to move on to our next segment of the show. And our next segment is called Ship It or Skip It.
Ship or skip. Everybody, we got to tell us if you ship or skip.
And the first one, I thought, and you kind of hit on it a little bit earlier, but this whole idea of, the vision everybody says is that we're just going to have these agents running our businesses. It's just going to be autonomous agents everywhere. What do you think about these autonomous AI workflows, completely autonomous and just turning these things loose? What do you think about that idea?
So it's skip it if you're starting with the autonomous workflow. That's ship it, or that's skip it. It's ship it if you think of the autonomous workflow as an enabler of something that is going to generate value first.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So the example there would be we talked, just to draw it back to what we said before, is if you start with the agentic workflow, you're going to have adoption problems. Perhaps you're going to have, the risk of investing and you're automating something that doesn't need to be automated, all those things that go with that. But if you now clearly define, here's this process that we've gone through the aches and pains of evolving, and we're sure that it's something that's relevant to our people and relevant to our business, then you can collaborate with groups and there are a lot of them out there. I work with a couple of them that are very good at putting autonomous agent structures to enable all those analyses. So if you think about if you went through that process and you had, let's say, 3 precise aspects of a workflow that you're getting efficiencies from. Now, there's an inefficiency in having to do that, then switch to human and do that, then back to human and do the next one. And, it's more efficient, but it's still challenging. But then if you can build an autonomous agentic workflow that facilitates that sits on top of it and also does the analysis of key nodes with checkpoints, however there wants to be, you want to have the human in the loop, then it's very much a ship it.
Yeah, I think I'm the same way. Right now, when you're developing these workflows, you can kind of let the LLM, the brain, the planner choose its own adventure completely. It's a little crazy right now. There may be certain low risk areas where maybe you experiment with that. But more of that kind of, I guess LangGraph is a good example of a framework for those sort of things where you're kind of predefining the general path and you're giving it a framework for how does it navigate the problem space and here are the connections between different states and whatnot.
Well,
that works a little better.
And that would be, so I was thinking agentic means a lot of things, right? There's also, there's agentic within a given analysis, structure, right? That has this way in which it collects, collates, validates, update, goes through this continuous learning process. That's subtly different in that you could technically overlay that onto something without really understanding exactly what it does. Now, there's a risk to that, but you still have the same fundamental question of those aren't cheap solutions to do well. And it's not inexpensive to set up a really good agentic process. And so steps that you can take to build confidence that you're putting that money in the right place And a good way to do that is, does this generate value the old fashioned way? All right, now let's make it better. Let's make it faster. Let's make it span more aspects of what we do.
Yeah. So kind of that incremental and iterative improvement. Yeah. I like it. Okay. What about AI first organizational operating systems? That's a lot of words. Kind of that where the AI is like that centralized enterprise brain, like that's controlling the organization. I mean, you've even seen it like governments were saying that they have a representative, they're training an AI to make decisions that are based on, the constituents and all of that. There's these ideas. What do you think about those ideas?
This tears at so many different things, and I'll play the game. My head says ship it. My heart says skip it. Well, so what do I mean by that? My heart says that in the skip it side is that beware of the, how do you want to say this? Beware of the benevolent dictator. Right. And so what are you doing when it's hyperbolic, right? But be careful with the system that automates decisions based on quote unquote unbiased information. Right. So even if the information is unbiased, there's a great example. There's a company that's forming in the pharma space, which is an area I do a decent amount of work in with my background, where they're at least asking the right questions in terms of how these data sets feed the decisioning. So saying that for most people, when you think about peer-reviewed literature, so the Harvard study showed this, or MIT or directional university, whatever it is, they have different types in there. Everyone assumes that means it's all good. But it isn't. It's very much not all good, and it very much isn't always applicable. And so this organization called GenAI, I believe, is developing products that very explicitly go in and govern and decide what information and to pay attention to and what information not to. That's a very hard challenge. It sounds like it might be simple, but it's not. It's really tough unless you really, really know an area. And so the reason I bring up that example is for something like that to be the central core, there has to be either a level of explicit trust in what information propagates out of that central core and how it's decisioned upon. Because another challenge too is that more information isn't always better. Right. It's, so you think about when you get information, like, is it better to read 8 articles or is it better to read 1 article more closely? I'll leave that for your listeners to decide, but often the 8 is very tough to ingest. So let's say it's putting out more information and is making certain decisions. And so that has to be either close to being right, which gets to that genomenon question of how do you make it close to being right? And, or you have to have the structure in place to see what are those decisions and what's something that can be safely automated with minimal risk and what's something that needs some interaction. So a good example is some of the agentic tools that are being developed in the healthcare space with your healthcare providers. One of the main tenets that we see is that most physicians, most healthcare providers are very comfortable with agentic autonomy when it's something like scheduling or it's more of an administrative task.
Sure.
But anytime it gets into care of the patient, then they want at the very least some visibility and some sign off, right? They don't want that just to flow through the system. And so I think the challenge is, you have to set up safeguards in a different way. And you just have to be careful about letting something like that run amok. You don't want to put your people in a position to where they're having to argue against the autonomous solution. Right? Because it's an argument that they may not be able to win, even though they're right. It's like debating with a really good debater or someone that's they're very articulate, skilled at arguing and generating ideas. You can be wrong, but win the debate, right? And someone can be right. They just can't articulate why they're right. So it's just, there's this careful balance. So I think that the concept of it is ship it, if you're willing to think about those downstream effects and plan around them and organize and be willing to accept the risk that goes along with, and perhaps, classifying what decisions are made autonomously and what decisions are just teed up to then be made.
Yeah, I guess I'm maybe aligned with you. I think I see the value in, because I do think that the LLMs and artificial intelligence can get to a level where it can process more data. It can process and be aware of more things than we can in our brains. So I think it can make more effective decisions. So I'll give you an example, like, self-driving cars. If you were to replace all the cars with self-driving cars, we would have less accidents, right?
That's what they're saying.
That's
this
what
is
they
one of those
say.
things where I take people's word for it.
Yeah.
I don't know the data. If someone asks me, how are you so confident? I'm like, well, I heard someone say it.
I mean, the self-driving car people tell us that, so it's got to be true, right?
Right.
But I mean, it's just an example of something where they probably could, operate those machinery on aggregate. We would have better outcomes overall, right, on the aggregate. But I think it's those decisions. So I think about it, especially organizationally. If you have policies and all that, but one thing I've learned about leadership is that it's those human decisions that make you a good leader. Okay, the policy says X, but this is going to impact one of our employees, and their husband just got laid off from work, or their grandmother just passed away, or whatever it is. But I mean, like that human outcome is going to be really, really bad for this person if we just say, go by the book, and this is the policy, do it exactly as the book says. That's where I don't think the LLM is going to make those decisions the way I would.
I'll use it out, and people can agree or disagree with this, but I like sports. I've got a football picture in the back here, so somewhere. There's the idea of analytics in sports, right? But some, more traditional coaches, I think, have correctly identified that analytics are big data, right? But scenarios are very different, right? They might have some knowledge. Okay, on the last play, I don't know how well everyone knows football, but I'll make it more generalized. That player on the other team really got embarrassed. Or like, I know something about that other player on the other team, or some advantage that we have. That changes the calculus, right? So you apply big data. So the analysis for the analogy for business is, how many considerations are there that the model can't possibly comprehend? Right. So things that are in between your ears, we call it institutional knowledge, and some institutional knowledge can be extracted and applied in a model. But some, it's almost, even if you know what it is, it's so hard to define it and have it be considered in a useful way. Right.
So if you think about that without knowing, intuition.
If you think about that sports analogy, how would you factor that into the analytics? Even if you know it could be a thing, like that's an enormous problem of planning and data engineering to figure something like that out.
Yeah, and it could be something completely subconscious. We don't know what we're noticing. So like that quarterback might see the cornerback that just got beat like a dog on a route. They come to the line, their shoulders are down. They're like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? Well, go right after him again, because he's going to try to overcorrect. He's going to try to overcompensate for that failure they just had. Keep at them, right? That's sort of whatever the decision is. But you may not even be able to articulate, why do I know that I should do that right now? You can't even
so this
explain.
is, I think, just to tie it back to your question, I can't help myself on this, is if it's a generative AI first company, and let's say the people you intentionally brought in know those limitations, they understand, what should be made autonomous, what needs human oversight, how you manage the massive amount of data that's being generated, how you weigh those interpersonal or nuances like we're talking about, put the human in the loop the right way. I would say that it's much more of like a ship it. If you're an organization that isn't used to working that way, and then you plug this hard into it, that essentially it doesn't necessarily change the way you work, but it changes the way you would need to work and the way you would operate in the business. I'll be transparent. I haven't seen an organization try to do it on that scale, because they're mostly too risk averse to do it. But I can't imagine that going very well.
I agree. All right. So, okay, we've done 2, ship it or skip it. Let's do it. Let's do a third. What about this idea of these cognitive collaboration platforms? You have collaboration tools where AI is actually acting as a contributor to ideation and those sort of things, creating new ideas, innovating, identifying areas of risk, those sort of things. What do you think about those platforms?
I think, I'll say 99.9% ship it. and the 1% is, the devil's always in the details in terms of how those systems are set up, how that model is set up. But at least from what in my own work and what I see with organizations, one of the best usages, I hesitate to call it a use case because it's broader than that. It's like a general category of usage for it, which is here's something, give me some things I should think about, or write a first draft for me, or okay, I have these 5 ideas. Here's our risk framework. Where do you potentially see the risks? It serves a really good purpose in getting past log jams and providing, counter opinions. The reason why the 0.1, it has to do that well, right? It has to be good information. And the people in the room I say have to. It's more productive if the people in the room think of it as, a 5th person in the room, not the final arbiter of every decision, right? So the LLM or the GenAI application gave us these 5 risks. If we don't get those 5 risks right, it's not going to work. It's like, well, the better way to say is like, these are 5 risks that we at least need to discuss and either, keep or dismiss or, somewhere in between. And so as long as the group is working collaboratively, and then even if you rely on what the guidance of that tool 100%, there's at least clarity and consensus on why that decision was made, why it wasn't made. So yeah, I love the idea because then that puts it it's not this single source of truth. It's a collaborator, and it's providing ideas that, either you may not have thought about, or you just on that day, it wasn't coming to mind, which of course happens to all of us, every minute of every day. And so it helps with that. And it helps in a lot of those use cases in that type of collaboration role. It helps inject ideas into the group and stimulate conversation. Yeah. It gets the ball rolling. And I really like use cases that do that.
Yeah, I think that's one thing I love about, LLM systems. I know, of course, everybody's like, oh, that's such a great idea when, that's how they always answer you. They're affirming you all the time. However, if you are careful to frame the LLM and say, you are this persona, this is your personality, you're a risk assessment, whatever, they actually do a really good job of kind of like flipping the switch and taking on that new persona much better than a human being does. You ever try that? And you're like, okay, here, Sally, you take the counterpoint of this argument. And then their arguments, it's always weak because they don't believe in it. But an LLM, they come at you both barrels. They're gonna flip the switch and say, okay, now I'm coming at you from a different perspective. I'm gonna argue with you. They actually do a really good job with that.
Well, and I love what you said, James. I'd suggest to your listeners, anytime you're having an LLM take on a task, define it at the start. Meaning define that, like we talked about that prompt optimizing step earlier in the discussion. Start off, first sentence, you are a prompt optimizer. Tell it that. And for reasons that, I think we conceptually understand, we don't know how it does it, perhaps from a technical standpoint behind the scenes, but it does make a big difference. It's very good at putting on that pair of shoes and being the prompt optimizer, being the devil's advocate, as you alluded to.
Yeah. As I said, like when you try these exercises with human beings, if my heart of hearts says this is the right thing, and then you say, oh, well, now argue against yourself, I don't do a very good job at that. Come on. That's like my software developers aren't really good testers of their own code, right? I don't want my code to break. My code's beautiful. But but LLMs, they don't care. They can take on that different persona like instantly, and they do it well. So yeah, I like it. I think that could be a good idea.
The whole basis of research is, without getting into nuances, you're never trying to prove something. You're trying to reject. You're trying to, within a degree of confidence, reject that phenomena doesn't exist. So your listeners can listen to that a few times, but it's the difference between proving something and rejecting what they call the null hypothesis, which is this phenomena doesn't exist. We can say within 95% certainty that it does exist, right? When you do your research. And the reason why I bring up that example is that is a very hard mindset to stay in, even when you're in a very precisely defined challenge, like a research question. So yeah, asking yourself to do that throughout a day or asking others to do it is really, really tough. of saying like, assume that I'm wrong. You're essentially saying, assume that I'm wrong, or try to prove that I'm not wrong. That's tough, but the LLM does a great job of it.
Yeah. Even like I have a mathematics background, at least from college. And like one of the types of proof was like to assume the incorrect is correct first, and then, set up the information such that it disproves. I forget what the technique of proof is, but there was one proof type that was always hard for me. It was like, okay, hold on. Assume that there is a greatest integer that in existence. And if that's n, well, what about n plus 1? That's got to be greater. Those ideas anyway.
Yeah. And I would wager you've over your, since you were exposed to that idea, maybe you came around, maybe you didn't, through the course of the semester or whenever. But my suspicion is you've had that thought pop into your head repeatedly throughout your life. It's like, okay, now I understand why that was so important to think about something that way at the start. And so those are back to the idea of, how do you get from academia to applying in areas like this? There are some universal principles that were established through academia that I think often serve you well in terms of, well, what did we actually prove or not here?
Mm-hmm.
Let's be clear on like how confident we should be in this. And so it's an interesting way of thinking about things.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those critical thinking skills, being able to take that opposing viewpoint. All right. Well, this that does it for Ship It or Skip It. Our next segment of the show is the lightning round. If you've listened to the show before, you know that the lightning round is the most important part of the show. This is where, we stop with all the tomfoolery, you know what I mean? And all the silliness of the show. And we really get serious, and we get down to where these are the questions that matter. They are graded. There is a correct and an incorrect answer to these. There is an algorithm that we use to calculate the score of how well you did. It takes weeks. We'll get back with you on your score. But this is where it gets serious. So I just want to make sure that you can frame yourself and you prepare yourself mentally for the lightning round. Are you ready?
Ready.
Okay. I love that you took a breath there. That's good.
I did a deep exhale.
Yeah, I like that. That's good. So what was your favorite childhood TV show?
Favorite childhood TV show, keeping it fast. I could contradict myself here. This was The Simpsons. I think I was delaying with my words for a second because it wasn't coming. I knew it was there, but The Simpsons, I don't watch it anymore, but I still, like, even now I watch the old episodes, and there's always something new that you didn't catch when you were a kid, but it was still entertaining when you were a kid. That mastery of putting that together is remarkable, at least in the old episodes. I don't know the new ones as much.
Yeah. And apparently they were pretty good at predicting the future. Have you seen some of those things where they're like, they show in the episodes that like a new current event is happening? And like, wait a minute, if you look back on this episode of The Simpsons, they showed this exact scenario.
I'm gonna put a note on that. I do know that when I watched them recently, I become very annoying because everything reminds me of a Simpsons episode, like everything about, your life, like a funny situation. But yeah, that's definitely my favorite show as a kid. Yeah.
Okay. Is there such a thing as objective beauty?
In the eye of the beholder, no. I would say at a societal level, probably yes. And What do I mean by that? Saying that that's just the idea that there are things that are more likely or less likely to trigger some feeling of attraction across like a group of people. And so if our definition of objective is back to this idea of the research, there's never 100% certainty on anything, but is it more likely to be something that's considered beautiful or not? There are certainly categories of that. Now that doesn't influence necessarily how I feel or how you feel about a given. My mind went to physical traits, but we could think about art. We could think about sunsets, whatever it is. At the personal level, no. At the societal level, yeah, I think so.
All right. From a scale of 1 to 10, how hot do you like your shower water?
This is actually a complicated question because I'm one of those idiots that does cold plunges now.
Okay. All right.
The cold plunge broke, so I take colder showers now. But I'd say if I'm being honest, 8 in terms of hot. if I'm in there to feel comfortable and take a shower, if I'm in there to get energized, one,
Nice.
and I used to not even be able to touch cold water, but since I started doing the cold plunges, I can just kind of stand in there and deal with it. So it's a bit of a complicated internal battle with shower temperature.
I've heard, like, I'm a house full of women, right? So I have a wife and 3 daughters. So I have heard that, like, you do the hot shower, clean everything out, get all the pores opened up and clean your face and all that stuff. And then at the end, when you do cold water, that kind of closes everything up. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what I hear. So maybe there's something to that.
Well, it is like, for all the cold shower takers out there, like, you just can't get yourself as clean with cold water as you can with hot water. Like try to like, rub off dirt with cold water versus hot water. It's not even close to. And so, and I think that reminded me of something. My wife thinks I'm a complete lunatic, which I guess is just part of.
That's something that's also universal.
Part of being married. That perhaps is a universal thing.
What about, okay, I'm going to start asking this for a little while of everyone, because I'm curious on this one. It seems I'm developing or seeing a pattern here. This is an interesting question. Do you like the smell of gasoline?
I do.
Nobody has said no yet that I've asked that question. To my recollection, I don't know, Ryan, you might be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think everybody has said yes. It's an interesting phenomenon.
Well, I had a friend in high school that he would even go so far to like spray a little bit on his hands so that when he'd drive, it would come with him, which I thought was a little bit extreme because that's obviously probably not safe. And, you're having gas on your hands anyway. But yeah, it's interesting that, I would never even think of that as a question, but now that you say it, I think everyone I know at least likes the aroma, while they're filling up their car.
Yeah. It's kind of it's like one of those, like, you don't say it out loud kind of a thing, right? You're like, yeah, I kind of like the smell of gasoline. But like when I first saw the question, I was like, wow, I thought nobody's going to say yes to this. I'm the only person in the world that likes the smell of gasoline, but everybody has said yes. So far.
Yeah. You have to find that person says no, and then,
we'll
dig a little bit.
What's
up
stop.
with this person?
Yeah. It will cease to be a lightning round at that moment. And we're going to dig in and figure out, we're going to lock in, as the kids say. Okay. All right. If you were really hungry, would you eat a bug?
Yeah, I think so. I assume so. I mean, it depends on how, if that was my only nourishment. I mean, I like to think I have healthy eating habits, and I'll eat certain things that are probably a bit surprising, without having that hunger aspect. So yeah, I would assume I would. I've been fortunate not to have had to eat a bug, although I probably did when I was a kid and I don't remember, but
Yeah. Picked up my kid from daycare one time and she had like some kind of bug in her mouth when I got there. And I was like, oh, maybe they should be paying more attention.
Yeah. Yeah. I know my kids want to eat, I've had to like pull bugs out of their hands as they've been, zeroing in on their mouths.
No, that's not. I mean, we get kind of on our high horses about this. Like, oh, I would never eat a bug. But if you think back, like the very first person who drank cow's milk, that person, and it's got to be a guy, let's face it, right? It wasn't a woman who did that. They have better sense than that. Some dude said, hey, let's drink some cow's milk. I bet that guy did a lot of other weird stuff, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah. How did mores and popular things develop is, there's often either a funny, whether it's real or made up story behind it, that's interesting to hear about.
All right, so let's do a few more of these here. I have a list. I just kind of scroll through and pick things. Okay, this one we haven't asked in a while. Are your grandparents mildly rude?
Well, not to bring, they have since passed, but that's okay. Yeah. I'd say, one of them in particular was, I would say, rude with a good spirit. I think they were, I'm not even going to say he or she to narrow it down. They were rude in a way that, only an 85-year-old can be.
Mm-hmm.
And so the other three were exceptionally nice people, but one of them in particular, I think.
Fair enough. Super Mario Brothers or Zelda?
Zelda. I like the adventure. I like getting, the sword powered up, the different levels of shields, all those things that, any good kid that plays video games, wakes up at 5 o'clock in the morning to play video games before their parents get up.
Yes, mostly Fortnite these days, but yes, we've done that in the past. Okay.
Get a new skin or whatever it is.
So this could be a particularly interesting question for you because you might know the actual answer to this. And I had to look it up the other day because it was something else. And I'll tell you after you answer. Why can't we tickle ourselves?
I mean, I'm just going to assume it's an element of surprise, but I don't know that for sure.
I think that's basically it. But I have a dad's chat with some of the other dads from our school, and somebody posted something and said, can a minotaur, half human, half horse or whatever, can they smack themselves on the rear end to make themselves go faster? That was a question. I was like, well, I think actually that probably relates to why we can't tickle ourselves. I was thinking of this question. I looked it up, and apparently anytime you touch your own skin or you're about to, create a touch sensation on yourself, your brain deadens that reaction. You don't feel it as intensely as if you didn't know it was coming. If you're inducing it on yourself, your brain just basically, it deadens those senses and it ignores those signals to a degree. So that's why you can't tickle yourself. But these are the kind of things that dads talk about, like can a minotaur make himself run faster by smacking himself on the butt? That's important stuff. These are the things.
Yeah. I mean, I don't see why not.
Yeah. And they're like, well, what are you thinking? That's the kind of things I'm thinking about right there. The useless stuff. Anyway. All right. One more. Let's do a final question here. Let's one more. The final question. All right. On a scale of 1 to 10, how good are you at wiffle ball?
Oh, I would say I used to think 8, but 5. I played with some friends out in LA with people that play wiffle ball.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, I'm not that good at this. Like anything else, the first time you play badminton with somebody that's really good at badminton, it's like, I'm not good at badminton. I thought I was good because I was good in my gym class, let's say. But 5, very, very mediocre.
That's like the people who say, oh, yeah, I'm pretty good at volleyball when I got a beer in one hand and I'm out at the picnic, just hitting the ball over, and then you watch like these girls, the college final or the national championship tournaments going on right now. That's not even the same sport. It's crazy.
No, it's not.
Okay. All right. Well, I think you did fairly well. Honestly, I do a lot
I'll wait 3 or 4 weeks and get the official results.
Yeah, I can't say definitively. Anything you've got coming up in the near future? Are you going to be speaking anywhere? Any like you're writing a book or anything like that you've got coming up that you want to share with the audience?
A couple notable things of, I think aside from just continuing to put together and share the generative AI readiness, not the research, but the survey. And then we plan on publishing a lot of that data, of course, anonymized, but, as we're seeing new trends, publishing those trends. But, one thing in particular I'm excited about is, a partnership, and I won't name the companies at this point because we're early and I don't want to, put anybody out there, but a partnership with a group that's, going to help us and help the companies we work with bridge that gap between identifying where those accretive solutions are and then layering and creating the custom agentic workflows that sit on top of it. And so, that I think what we've talked about a lot has sounded very theoretical in terms of how it comes together. But what we're trying to do is bridge we talked about the value gap of, well, you can find something that makes you more efficient, but how do you really maximize the value? Mm-hmm. And so being able to layer that technology on top of it. So that's something we're really excited about.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate you coming on the show. It was a great conversation. Really enjoyed it. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, this was great. Thanks so much, James. And look forward to hearing the podcast and all the best.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you all for listening today. And if you'd like to get in touch with us here at the /, drop us a line at the / at Calibrity.com. See you next time. The / podcast is created by Calibrity. The / team is director and producer Ryan Wilson, editing by Steve Baradelli, marketing support by Taylor Blessing, and I'm your host, James Carman. Thanks for listening.